The experience of feeling something, the quickening of the pulse when confronted with danger, the warmth that spreads through the chest when encountering someone beloved, the sinking sensation in the stomach when receiving unwelcome news, these phenomena seem so immediate, so fundamentally personal, that we rarely pause to consider them as objects of study, as products of evolution, as cultural constructions, as neurochemical processes that can be measured, mapped, and to some degree predicted. Yet the history of how human beings have understood, categorized, and attempted to control their emotional lives represents one of the most fascinating intellectual journeys across civilizations, and it is a journey that remains profoundly unfinished, with major discoveries continuing to reshape our understanding of what it means to feel. The ancient Greeks, whose philosophical traditions would shape Western thought for millennia, did not possess a single word that directly corresponds to our modern concept of emotion. They spoke instead of pathos, which encompassed suffering, experience, and what befalls a person from outside. And they discussed deimos, often translated as spirit or passion, which was associated with anger, courage, and the impulse toward action. The philosopher Plato, writing in the 4th century before the Common Era, proposed a tripartite division of the soul in which reason occupied the highest position, with spirit and appetite as lower functions that required governance by the rational faculty. This hierarchical model, in which emotions were understood primarily as disruptive forces requiring control by reason, would prove remarkably persistent, appearing in various forms across subsequent centuries and across multiple cultural traditions. Aristotle, Plato's student, offered a somewhat different and more nuanced analysis. In his Rhetoric, composed as a practical guide for public speaking, he provided detailed descriptions of specific emotional states including anger, fear, shame, envy, and pity, analysing their causes, their characteristic thought patterns, and their social functions. For Aristotle, emotions were not merely blind impulses but involved beliefs and judgments about the world. Anger, for instance, was understood to arise from a perceived slight or injustice, which meant that to change someone's anger, one might need to change their beliefs about what had occurred. This cognitive dimension of emotional life, the recognition that how we interpret events shapes what we feel about them, would be rediscovered and elaborated by psychologists in the 20th century, often without full awareness of how thoroughly Aristotle had already explored this territory. The Stoic philosophers, who developed their school in Athens beginning around 300 before the Common Era, and whose influence would extend through the Roman period and into Christian thought, pushed this cognitive analysis even further. For thinkers like Zeno of Citium, Chrysippus, Seneca, Epictetus, and Marcus Aurelius, what we call emotions were essentially errors of judgment, false beliefs about what is truly good or bad for human beings. The Stoics argued that only virtue is genuinely good, and only vice genuinely bad, while everything else, including health, wealth, reputation, and even the lives of loved ones, belongs to the category of preferred indifference, things it is natural to pursue, but not to be disturbed by losing. From this philosophical position, they developed elaborate practical techniques for managing emotional disturbance, including the premeditation of adversity, the view from above that places individual troubles in cosmic perspective, and the close examination of value judgments at the moment of emotional arousal. These techniques bear striking resemblance to methods developed independently in cognitive behavioral therapy during the late 20th century, a convergence that has attracted considerable scholarly attention and has led to renewed interest in Stoic philosophy as a practical resource. In parallel with Greek philosophical developments, but following a quite different trajectory, Chinese thinkers were elaborating their own accounts of emotional life. The Confucian tradition, developing from the teachings attributed to Kongzi in the 5th and 6th centuries before the Common Era, placed enormous emphasis on the cultivation of appropriate emotional responses as central to moral development and social harmony. The concept of Ren, often translated as benevolence or humaneness, was understood not as an abstract principle, but as a quality manifested in appropriate emotional attunement to others, particularly within the structured relationships of family and state. Confucian texts discuss the proper emotions for mourning, for encountering different categories of persons, for serving one's parents and one's ruler, suggesting a sophisticated awareness of how emotional expression both reflects and constitutes social relationships. The Taoist tradition, particularly as expressed in texts like the Tao Te Ching and the Zhuangzi, offered a different emphasis, often advocating for a kind of emotional equanimity or naturalness that contrasted with what Taoists saw as the artificial emotional cultivation promoted by Confucian ritual practice. The emergence of Buddhist thought in India, traditionally dated to the 5th century before the Common Era, brought yet another distinctive approach to understanding and transforming emotional life. The Buddha's teaching placed the problem of suffering at the centre of spiritual concern, and the analysis of suffering led directly to an analysis of the mental and emotional states that perpetuate it. The Buddhist tradition developed extraordinarily detailed taxonomies of mental states, distinguishing wholesome from unwholesome qualities, and elaborated meditation practices designed to cultivate specific positive emotions like compassion and loving kindness, while weakening the grip of destructive states like craving, aversion, and ignorance. The Buddhist analysis emphasized the impermanent and constructed nature of emotional states, encouraging practitioners to observe their arising and passing away without identification, a practice that contemporary neuroscientists have begun to study using brain imaging technologies, finding distinctive patterns of neural activity in long-term meditation practitioners. As we move through ancient history into the medieval period in both European and Asian contexts, we find that theories of emotion were intimately connected to theories of the body and to cosmological frameworks that structured understanding of both nature and human experience. In the European tradition deriving from ancient Greek medicine, particularly the works associated with Hippocrates and elaborated by the Roman physician Galen in the 2nd century of the Common Era, the concept of the 4 humours provided a comprehensive framework for understanding temperament, health, and emotional tendencies. According to this theory, the body contained 4 fundamental fluids: blood, yellow bile, black bile, and phlegm, whose relative balance determined not only physical constitution, but also characteristic emotional patterns. An excess of blood was associated with the sanguine temperament, characterized by cheerfulness, optimism, and social engagement. Yellow bile in excess produced the choleric temperament, prone to anger, ambition, and decisive action. Black bile, when predominant, was understood to generate melancholy, the condition of sadness, contemplation, and withdrawal that would attract intense cultural interest across centuries. Phlegm in excess was associated with the phlegmatic temperament, marked by calmness, patience, and sometimes apathy. This humoral framework was not merely a medical theory, but a comprehensive world view that connected the human body to cosmic order, linking the 4 humours to the 4 elements: earth, water, fire, air, the 4 seasons, the 4 ages of life, and even the 4 cardinal directions. Medieval European thought inherited this system and elaborated it in complex ways, integrating it with Christian theological concerns about the soul and its relationship to bodily existence. The experience of emotions was understood in this context as a psychosomatic phenomenon, involving both spiritual and physical dimensions, and treatments for emotional disturbance might include both spiritual practices like prayer and confession, and physical interventions like dietary modification, bloodletting, and the adjustment of living conditions to restore humoral balance. The specific emotion of melancholy attracted particular attention across medieval and early modern European culture, becoming the subject of one of the most remarkable works of prose in the English language, Robert Burton's The Anatomy of Melancholy, first published in 1621 and expanded in subsequent editions until the author's death in 1640. Burton's work, running to hundreds of thousands of words, attempted a comprehensive treatment of melancholy's causes, symptoms, and cures, drawing on medical, philosophical, theological, and literary sources from across European and classical tradition. The very existence of such a massive work devoted to a single emotional condition testifies to the cultural importance attached to understanding emotional suffering, but also to the ways in which such understanding was embedded in a web of learned discourse, quite different from modern psychological science. Traditional Chinese medicine developed its own comprehensive framework for understanding the relationship between emotions and bodily health, one that shared certain structural features with the humoral system while differing significantly in its specific content. Chinese medical thinking emphasized the circulation of qi, vital energy, through channels in the body, and understood strong emotions as capable of disrupting this circulation in ways that produce specific disease patterns. The correspondences between particular emotions and particular organ systems became standardized. Anger was associated with the liver, joy with the heart, worry with the spleen, grief with the lungs, and fear with the kidneys. These associations were not merely theoretical, but had practical implications for diagnosis and treatment, with physicians attending to a patient's emotional state as part of comprehensive assessment, and prescribing treatments intended to restore both physical and emotional balance. The early modern period in Europe, roughly the 16th through 18th centuries, saw significant developments in how emotions were conceptualized, developments connected to broader shifts in natural philosophy, political thought, and the emergence of new forms of social organization. The philosopher René Descartes, writing in the mid-17th century, offered a systematic treatment of the passions in his 1649 work, The Passions of the Soul, attempting to provide a mechanistic account of how emotions arise from the interaction between the immaterial mind and the material body, which he located at the pineal gland. Descartes identified 6 primitive passions: wonder, love, hatred, desire, joy, and sadness, from which all other emotional states could be derived through combination. His approach represented an attempt to bring the study of emotions within the scope of the new mechanical philosophy, treating the body as a kind of machine whose operations could be understood through physical principles. The political philosophy of the early modern period also developed distinctive views about the role of emotions in social life. Thomas Hobbes, writing in the aftermath of the English Civil War, portrayed human beings as fundamentally driven by the passions, particularly by fear of violent death and by the competitive desire for power and recognition. His political theory, elaborated in Leviathan, published in 1651, argued that rational self-interest should lead individuals to submit to sovereign authority as the only alternative to the chaos of natural existence, where life would be, in his famous phrase, solitary, poor, nasty, brutish, and short. Later thinkers in the Scottish Enlightenment, including David Hume, Adam Smith, and Francis Hutcheson, developed more positive accounts of the social emotions, arguing that human beings possess natural capacities for sympathy and benevolence that make social life possible without requiring the absolute sovereign that Hobbes had deemed necessary. Adam Smith's theory of moral sentiments, published in 1759, offered a sophisticated analysis of how we imaginatively enter into the emotions of others and how our desire for their approval shapes our moral development, an account that anticipated aspects of both evolutionary psychology and developmental psychology in the 20th century. The Romantic movement that emerged in the late 18th and early 19th centuries represented a significant cultural reassessment of the value of emotional experience. Against what Romantics perceived as the cold rationalism of the Enlightenment, poets, artists, and philosophers like Jean-Jacques Rousseau, William Wordsworth, Johann Wolfgang von Goethe, and Samuel Taylor Coleridge celebrated the authenticity of feeling, the sublimity of powerful emotional experience, and the importance of emotional expression for individual flourishing and artistic creation. This cultural shift had implications beyond the arts, contributing to new ideas about child-rearing that emphasized emotional nurturing, to new forms of religious expression that prioritized personal feeling over doctrinal correctness, and to new political ideologies that appealed to national sentiment and popular passion. The Romantic valuation of emotion also had darker aspects, as the celebration of intensity could shade into the glorification of suffering, and the emphasis on authenticity could foster suspicion of the emotional conventions that enable social cooperation. The 19th century brought the emergence of scientific psychology as a discipline distinct from philosophy, and with it came new approaches to the study of emotion that sought to apply the methods of natural science to the understanding of mental life. Charles Darwin's 1872 work, The Expression of the Emotions in Man and Animals, represented a landmark contribution, bringing evolutionary thinking to bear on emotional phenomena. Darwin argued that emotional expressions are products of natural selection, originally serving adaptive functions that may persist even when they no longer serve those functions in modern humans. He documented the expressions associated with various emotions through careful observation, photography, and correspondence with observers around the world, attempting to demonstrate both the universality of certain expressions across cultures and their continuity with expressions observed in other animal species. Darwin's work established the agenda for evolutionary approaches to emotion that would be extensively developed in the late 20th and early 21st centuries. The American philosopher and psychologist William James, writing in the 1880s and 1890s, proposed a counterintuitive theory of emotion that would generate debate for over a century. James argued, against common sense, that bodily changes come first and emotional experience follows. As he memorably put it, we do not tremble because we are afraid. Rather, we are afraid because we tremble. The perception of bodily changes, James argued, constitutes the emotion rather than being caused by it. A similar theory was independently proposed by the Danish physician Carl Lang, and the combined position came to be known as the James-Lang theory. Critics pointed out that bodily states do not seem sufficiently differentiated to account for the variety of emotional experiences, and physiological research showed that similar patterns of autonomic nervous system activation could accompany quite different emotional states. The American physiologist Walter Cannon and his colleague Philip Bard proposed an alternative in which emotional experience and bodily response occur simultaneously, both triggered by activity in the thalamus and hypothalamus, brain structures that process sensory information and coordinate physiological responses. The early 20th century also saw the development of psychoanalytic theory, which offered a distinctive and influential account of emotional life. Sigmund Freud, beginning with his studies of hysteria in the 1890s and elaborating his theory over subsequent decades, proposed that much of emotional life is shaped by unconscious mental processes, by drives and desires and memories that are barred from conscious awareness through psychological defense mechanisms. Emotions in the psychoanalytic framework are not simply responses to present circumstances, but are deeply coloured by developmental history, particularly by early experiences with caregivers that establish templates for later emotional relationships. The concept of transference, in which emotional patterns originally formed in childhood are repeated in adult relationships, including the relationship with the analyst, became central to psychoanalytic treatment. Freud's specific theoretical claims have been subject to extensive criticism on empirical and methodological grounds, but his general insight that current emotional responses may be shaped by past experiences in ways not accessible to introspection has been supported by subsequent research in developmental psychology and neuroscience. The behaviorist movement that dominated American academic psychology from roughly the 1920s through the 1960s approached emotions quite differently, viewing them primarily as conditioned responses that could be analysed in terms of environmental stimuli and observable behaviours without reference to internal mental states. John B. Watson's famous 1920 experiment with the infant known as Little Albert demonstrated that fear responses could be conditioned through classical conditioning procedures, associating a previously neutral stimulus with an inherently frightening stimulus, until the neutral stimulus alone elicited the fear response. The behaviourist approach proved powerful for understanding certain aspects of emotional learning, particularly the acquisition and treatment of phobias, but its deliberate refusal to consider internal mental processes limited its ability to address the full complexity of emotional experience. The cognitive revolution in psychology that began in the 1950s and 1960s reopened the scientific study of mental processes, including the cognitive aspects of emotion that Aristotle and the Stoics had analysed millennia earlier. The work of Stanley Schachter and Jerome Singer in the 1960s proposed a two-factor theory of emotion, in which physiological arousal provides the raw material for emotional experience, but cognitive interpretation of that arousal in context determines which specific emotion is experienced. In their famous experiment, participants were injected with epinephrine, adrenaline, which produces physiological arousal, and were then placed in situations designed to suggest either euphoria or anger. Participants who did not know the true source of their arousal tended to interpret their feelings in line with the social context, feeling happy in the presence of a euphoric confederate, or angry in an anger-inducing situation. This research, though its findings have proved difficult to replicate and its methodology has been criticised, established the research paradigm of cognitive appraisal approaches to emotion that would dominate the field for decades. Richard Lazarus, whose work spanned from the 1960s through the 1990s, developed the most influential cognitive appraisal theory, proposing that emotions arise from evaluations of events in relation to personal goals and well-being. According to Lazarus, when we encounter a situation, we engage in primary appraisal, evaluating whether the situation is relevant to our goals and whether it is beneficial or harmful. We then engage in secondary appraisal, evaluating our coping resources and options for dealing with the situation. Different patterns of appraisal produce different emotions. Perceiving goal-relevant harm from an external agent produces anger. Perceiving an impending threat produces anxiety. Perceiving irrevocable loss produces sadness, and so forth. Lazarus's framework proved highly generative, inspiring research programs that investigated the specific appraisal patterns associated with different emotions across cultures and developmental stages. While cognitive approaches dominated experimental research, other theoretical perspectives were developing that emphasized the social and cultural dimensions of emotion. The sociologist Arlie Russell Hochschild, in her 1983 book The Managed Heart, introduced the concept of emotional labor to describe the work involved in managing one's emotional expression to meet the requirements of a job. Hochschild studied flight attendants and bill collectors, documenting how these workers were required to display particular emotions, cheerfulness and warmth for flight attendants, sternness and insistence for collectors, regardless of what they actually felt. She analysed the techniques workers used to manage their feelings, either through surface acting, adjusting expression without changing internal feeling, or through deep acting, actually working to change one's feelings to match required display. Hochschild's work highlighted the ways in which emotions are not purely private experiences, but are shaped by social expectations and economic demands, and the concept of emotional labour has since been applied to analyse work ranging from nursing to service industries to domestic care. Anthropological research conducted throughout the 20th century documented substantial, cross-cultural variation in emotional concepts, expression, and experience, raising important questions about the universality of emotions. Catherine Lutz's 1988 ethnography of the Ifaluk, a small atoll society in Micronesia, described a social and emotional world significantly different from that of Western societies. The Ifaluk had an emotion concept, song sometimes translated as justified anger, that was associated with moral authority and was especially appropriately felt by older women toward younger people who had violated social norms. Another concept, Fago, often translated as compassion, love, sadness, combined elements that English separates into distinct emotions and was considered the highest moral emotion. Lutz argued that understanding Faluk emotional life required understanding the cultural values, social relationships and moral frameworks within which emotions occurred, and she questioned whether Western emotion concepts like anger could be unproblematically applied across cultural boundaries. The question of emotional universality became a central debate in the field, with some researchers emphasizing universal features of emotion grounded in human biology and evolutionary history, while others emphasized cultural construction and variation. Paul Ekman's research program, beginning in the 1960s and continuing for decades, provided influential evidence for universality. Ekman and his colleagues presented photographs of facial expressions to people in diverse cultures, including isolated groups in Papua New Guinea who had had limited contact with Western media, and found that people across cultures could recognize certain expressions as depicting particular emotions, specifically happiness, sadness, anger, fear, surprise, and disgust. Ekman argued that these basic emotions are biologically based, universal features of human nature, produced by affect programs that are triggered automatically, and that generate coordinated changes in expression, physiology, and subjective experience. Critics of the basic emotions paradigm raised both empirical and theoretical objections. The psychologist James Russell argued that the cross-cultural recognition studies could be explained by participants using the provided emotion labels to make reasonable inferences rather than by direct recognition of universal expressions. Lisa Feldman Barrett has argued more fundamentally that what appear to be natural emotion categories are actually constructed from more basic psychological ingredients, including core affective states characterized by valence, whether an experience is pleasant or unpleasant, and arousal, how activated or deactivated one feels, combined with conceptual knowledge acquired through cultural learning. According to this constructionist view, the brain does not contain dedicated circuits for specific emotions like fear or anger, but rather constructs emotional episodes by integrating bodily sensations, situational information, and culturally learned concepts. Brain imaging research has not found consistent specific patterns of neural activity corresponding to particular emotion categories, which Barrett takes as evidence against the existence of biologically based basic emotions. The neuroscience of emotion underwent dramatic development with the advent of technologies for studying the living brain, including positron emission tomography, functional magnetic resonance imaging, and electroencephalography, as well as increasingly sophisticated methods for studying individual neurons in animal models. The amygdala, a small almond-shaped structure in the temporal lobe, received particular attention as a key structure for processing threatening stimuli and for learning associations between cues and aversive outcomes. Research by Joseph Ledoux demonstrated that sensory information about potential threats can reach the amygdala by two distinct pathways: a fast, direct pathway from the sensory thalamus that allows rapid, though crude, processing of danger, and a slower pathway through the sensory cortex that allows more detailed analysis. This dual pathway architecture helps explain why fear responses can be triggered before we are consciously aware of what has frightened us, and why these responses can sometimes be inappropriate when the fast pathway detects a false alarm. Research on the neurochemistry of emotion has identified numerous neurotransmitter systems that modulate emotional states and emotional processing. The monoamine neurotransmitters, including serotonin, dopamine, and norepinephrine, have received particular attention because of their involvement in psychiatric conditions and their modulation by commonly prescribed medications. Selective serotonin reuptake inhibitors, which increase serotonin availability at synapses, are widely prescribed for depression and anxiety disorders, though the mechanisms by which they produce their clinical effects remain incompletely understood, and the simple hypothesis that depression results from low serotonin has been shown to be inadequate. Dopamine is particularly associated with reward processing and motivation, with dopaminergic pathways activated by pleasurable stimuli and by cues that predict reward. The endogenous opioid system, which includes neurotransmitters like endorphins and their receptors, is involved in both pain modulation and social bonding, with research suggesting that the warm feelings associated with social connection involve some of the same neurochemical systems that mediate the effects of opioid drugs, a finding that helps explain why social rejection can feel physically painful. The role of bodily processes in emotional experience has been revisited with new theoretical sophistication through the concept of interoception, the perception of signals from within the body. The psychologist and neuroscientist Antonio Damasio proposed the somatic marker hypothesis, according to which bodily states play a crucial role in decision-making and emotional experience. Damasio studied patients with damage to the ventromedial prefrontal cortex who showed relatively intact intellectual abilities, but profound impairments in decision-making and emotional life, suggesting that the ability to use bodily signals to guide choices is essential for adaptive functioning. More recently, research on interoception has investigated individual differences in the ability to perceive internal bodily signals, with some studies finding that people who are more accurate in perceiving their heartbeat also show differences in emotional experience, though this relationship has proved complex and has not always replicated. The development of emotional capacities across the lifespan has been extensively studied, revealing a complex interplay between maturational processes and social experience. Infants are born with basic emotional capacities. They can express distress through crying and contentment through relaxed states, and they show preferences for pleasant over unpleasant stimuli. Over the first year of life, infants develop the ability to express a wider range of distinct emotions, and to use caregiver emotional expressions as social reference points for their own behaviour, as demonstrated in visual cliff experiments where infants are more willing to cross an apparently deep surface if their mother displays a happy rather than fearful expression. The development of emotion regulation the ability to modulate the intensity and duration of emotional states is a crucial developmental achievement that depends heavily on the quality of caregiver interactions. Attachment theory, developed initially by John Bowlby in the mid-20th century and elaborated through empirical research by Mary Ainsworth and many subsequent investigators, provides a framework for understanding how early relationships shape emotional development. Bowlby proposed that infants are biologically predisposed to form attachment relationships with caregivers, and that the quality of these relationships depends on caregiver sensitivity and responsiveness to infant signals. Ainsworth's strange situation procedure, which observes infant behaviour during brief separations from and reunions with the caregiver, revealed different patterns of attachment security that predict later social and emotional development. Securely attached infants whose caregivers have been consistently responsive use the caregiver as a secure base for exploration and are readily comforted after separation. Insecurely attached infants show various patterns of behaviour reflecting experience with less optimal caregiving, including avoidance of the caregiver, anxious clinging, or disorganised responses that suggest the caregiver has been a source of fear as well as comfort. Longitudinal research has shown that attachment patterns established in infancy predict emotional functioning years and even decades later, though these relationships are probabilistic rather than deterministic, and later experiences can modify early patterns. The study of emotion regulation has become one of the most active areas in affective science, addressing the strategies people use to influence which emotions they have, when they have them, and how they express them. James Gross's process model of emotion regulation distinguishes strategies based on when in the emotion generative process they intervene. Situation selection and situation modification occur before an emotional situation is encountered or while it is occurring. Attention deployment involves directing attention toward or away from emotional aspects of a situation. Cognitive change involves reinterpreting the meaning of a situation to alter its emotional impact. Response modulation involves attempts to influence emotional responses after they have been initiated. Research has shown that these different strategies have different consequences for emotional experience, physiological responding, and social relationships. Cognitive reappraisal, for example, tends to be associated with better outcomes than suppression of emotional expression, which can increase physiological arousal and interfere with memory formation, while creating interpersonal difficulties as interaction partners find suppressing individuals harder to read. The social functions of emotion have received increasing attention, with recognition that emotions are not merely internal states, but have crucial roles in coordinating social behaviour and communicating information. Emotional expressions provide information to observers about the expressor's internal states, appraisals, and likely future behaviour. Fear expressions, for example, signal the presence of threat and may automatically orient others' attention toward potential danger. Expressions of anger communicate that the expressor has been harmed and is prepared to retaliate, which can serve to deter future transgressions. Expressions of guilt and shame communicate recognition of wrongdoing and may serve to repair social relationships by indicating that the transgressor acknowledges having violated norms and is unlikely to repeat the behaviour. The social functions of emotion extend beyond expression to include emotional mimicry, the tendency to automatically imitate others' emotional expressions, which is thought to facilitate emotional contagion and interpersonal coordination. The experience of moral emotions, those emotions particularly concerned with evaluating actions and character in relation to moral standards, has attracted attention from both psychologists and philosophers. Guilt and shame are both negative emotions associated with perceived transgressions, but research has distinguished them in terms of their focus. Guilt typically involves focus on a specific behaviour that has violated standards, while shame involves focus on the self as flawed or inadequate. This distinction has practical implications, as guilt tends to motivate reparative behaviour, while shame may motivate withdrawal or defensive anger. Contempt, disgust, and anger have been proposed to form a cluster of moral emotions directed at different categories of violations: contempt for violations of hierarchy and respect, disgust for violations of purity and bodily integrity, and anger for violations of fairness and rights. Moral elevation, the positive emotion experienced when witnessing moral excellence, has been proposed as a counterpart to these negative moral emotions, motivating pro-social behaviour and moral aspiration. The relationship between emotion and moral judgment has been extensively investigated following research by Joshua Green, using brain imaging to study responses to moral dilemmas. Green found that personal moral dilemmas, those involving direct physical harm, activated brain regions associated with emotional processing, while impersonal moral dilemmas activated regions associated with reasoning and calculation. He proposed a dual process theory in which emotional intuitions and deliberative reasoning can produce conflicting moral judgments, as in the classic trolley problems where most people think it is permissible to divert a trolley to save 5 people at the cost of 1, but impermissible to push someone onto the tracks to achieve the same outcome. This research contributed to a broader turn toward recognizing the role of emotion and intuition in moral judgment, contrasting with rationalist traditions in moral philosophy that had emphasized the role of reason. The experience of positive emotions has historically received less research attention than negative emotions, but this imbalance has been partially redressed with the growth of positive psychology and increased interest in well-being, flourishing, and the conditions that promote them. Barbara Fredrickson's broaden and build theory proposes that positive emotions serve different functions than negative emotions. While negative emotions narrow attention and action tendencies in ways adapted to dealing with specific threats, positive emotions broaden thought-action repertoires, promoting exploration, play, and social connection. Over time, these broadened states help build enduring personal resources, including physical resources through play, intellectual resources through curiosity and learning, social resources through relationship building, and psychological resources through developing resilience and coping capacity. Research testing this theory has found that positive emotional states do indeed broaden attention and thinking, and that interventions increasing positive emotion can produce lasting improvements in well-being. The specific positive emotion of gratitude has attracted considerable research attention as a potential pathway to well-being. Gratitude interventions, in which participants regularly record things for which they are grateful, have been found in some studies to increase well-being and decrease depression, though effect sizes vary across studies and the mechanisms remain incompletely understood. The emotion of awe, experienced in response to vast, complex stimuli that challenge existing mental frameworks, has been studied as an emotion that may reduce self-focus and increase prosocial behavior. Compassion, the emotion experienced in response to others' suffering that motivates helping, has been studied as a trainable capacity, with meditation practices designed to cultivate compassion, producing changes in both brain activity and prosocial behavior. The relationship between emotion and physical health has been investigated across multiple levels of analysis, from population-level epidemiology to molecular mechanisms. Epidemiological research has found that measures of negative affect, including depression, anxiety, and hostility, predict increased risk of cardiovascular disease, immune dysfunction, and mortality, even after controlling for behavioral factors like smoking and physical inactivity. The magnitude of these relationships varies across studies, and establishing causal direction is challenging given that physical illness can itself produce psychological changes. Research on mechanisms has focused on several pathways through which emotional states might influence health. Chronic stress and negative emotion are associated with prolonged activation of the hypothalamic, pituitary adrenal axis, and sympathetic nervous system, producing elevated cortisol and catecholamines that can have damaging effects on cardiovascular and immune function over time. Inflammation has emerged as a key mediator, with psychological stress and negative effect associated with elevated inflammatory markers that are themselves risk factors for multiple diseases. Social relationships, which are deeply intertwined with emotional life, have been found to be among the strongest predictors of health and longevity across numerous studies. Loneliness, defined as the subjective experience of social isolation regardless of objective social contact, has been identified as a significant health risk factor. Research by John Cacioppo and colleagues found that loneliness is associated with elevated blood pressure, impaired immune function, and increased mortality risk. The mechanisms by which social connection protects health likely include both behavioral pathways, as relationships provide practical support and health-relevant information, and direct physiological pathways, as social connection may buffer stress responses and influence neuroendocrine and immune function. The study of emotional disorders has obvious clinical importance and has also contributed to basic understanding of emotional processes. Depression, affecting hundreds of millions of people worldwide and representing a leading cause of disability, has been extensively investigated. Cognitive theories of depression, developed by Aaron Beck and others, emphasize the role of negative thinking patterns in initiating and maintaining depressive states. Depressed individuals characteristically show negative biases in attention, interpretation, and memory, focusing on negative information, interpreting ambiguous situations negatively, and more readily recalling negative experiences. Behavioral theories emphasize the role of reduced positive reinforcement, as depression is associated with withdrawal from activities that previously provided pleasure and accomplishment. Neurobiological research has implicated multiple brain systems and neurochemical pathways, though no single cause has been identified, and depression likely results from multiple interacting factors, including genetic vulnerability, developmental experiences, stress, and inflammatory processes. Anxiety disorders, which are among the most common mental health conditions, involve dysregulation of fear and anxiety systems that normally serve protective functions. Specific phobias involve intense fear of particular objects or situations that are objectively harmless or pose minimal threat. Social anxiety disorder involves fear of negative evaluation in social situations that leads to avoidance of social interaction. Panic disorder involves recurrent unexpected panic attacks, episodes of intense fear with physical symptoms including racing heart, shortness of breath, and dizziness, along with fear of future attacks and their consequences. Generalized anxiety disorder involves chronic worry across multiple domains of life that is experienced as difficult to control. Post-traumatic stress disorder, which develops following exposure to traumatic events, involves symptoms including intrusive memories of the trauma, avoidance of trauma reminders, negative changes in cognitions and mood, and alterations in arousal and reactivity. Treatments for emotional disorders have developed considerably, with both pharmacological and psychological approaches showing effectiveness for various conditions. Cognitive behavioral therapy, which targets the thoughts and behaviors that maintain emotional disorders, has accumulated substantial evidence for effectiveness across depression, anxiety disorders, and other conditions. For depression, cognitive behavioral therapy addresses negative thinking patterns through techniques including identifying and challenging cognitive distortions, behavioral activation to increase engagement with reinforcing activities, and problem-solving for life difficulties. For anxiety disorders, exposure therapy, which involves systematic confrontation with feared situations, has been found to be particularly effective, working through mechanisms that are thought to include habituation, extinction of conditioned fear responses, and changes in expectations about the consequences of encountering feared stimuli. The development of mindfulness-based interventions represents a significant expansion of the treatment landscape in recent decades. Mindfulness-based stress reduction, developed by Jon Kabat-Zinn in the 1970s, adapted Buddhist meditation practices for medical populations, teaching participants to attend to present moment experience with an attitude of acceptance and non-judgment. Mindfulness-based cognitive therapy, developed for preventing depression relapse, integrates mindfulness practices with cognitive therapy principles. Researchers found these approaches effective for various conditions, though questions remain about which components are most important and which populations benefit most. Neuroscientific research on meditation has found that contemplative practices are associated with changes in brain structure and function, including alterations in regions involved in attention, self-awareness, and emotion regulation, though many studies have methodological limitations and the field is still developing. The cross-cultural study of emotion continues to generate important findings about both universal features and cultural variation. Research comparing emotional experience across cultures has found that while the dimensions of valence and arousal appear to be universal features of affective experience, the specific emotions that are named and considered important vary substantially across languages and cultures. Some emotions appear to be culture-specific, or at least lack direct translation across languages. The Japanese concept of ame, for instance, refers to a pleasant feeling of dependence on another person and has no direct English equivalent. The German concept of Schadenfreude, pleasure at another's misfortune, exists as a folk concept in English-speaking cultures but requires borrowing the German term. The Portuguese concept of saudade, a melancholic longing, and the Finnish concept of sisu, a kind of determined resilience, are claimed as distinctive features of their respective cultural emotional landscapes. Research on display rules, the cultural norms governing emotional expression, has documented systematic differences in what emotions are considered appropriate to express in different contexts across cultures. The distinction between individualist and collectivist cultures, while somewhat oversimplified, captures meaningful variation in emotional norms. More individualist cultures tend to value emotional authenticity and expression of personal feelings, while more collectivist cultures tend to value emotional restraint and maintenance of social harmony. These differences have implications for cross-cultural communication and for the interpretation of research findings, as measures developed in one cultural context may not transfer directly to others. The intersection of emotion with economic and political behaviour has attracted increasing attention from researchers seeking to understand how emotional factors influence decision-making beyond the laboratory. Traditional economic theory assumed that people make decisions by rationally calculating expected utility, but behavioural economics has documented numerous ways in which actual decision-making departs from rational models, often in ways that involve emotional factors. Loss aversion, the finding that losses loom larger than equivalent gains, may reflect the greater emotional impact of negative outcomes. The affect heuristic describes the tendency to base judgments on emotional reactions to options rather than on systematic analysis of their attributes. Emotional factors influence consumer behaviour, with research documenting effects of mood on purchasing decisions and effects of anticipated emotions like regret on choice. Political science has increasingly recognised the role of emotion in political behaviour, moving beyond earlier models that focused primarily on rational calculation of interests or on stable ideological commitments. Emotional responses to political events, candidates, and policies influence political attention, attitude formation, and voting behaviour. Anxiety appears to promote increased attention to information and more careful deliberation, while enthusiasm promotes engagement and mobilisation along existing dispositional lines. Anger at perceived injustice or threat mobilises political action, though the targets of anger can be influenced by how political situations are framed. The role of emotion in political polarisation has attracted attention, with research suggesting that partisan identity has taken on emotional characteristics, with partisans feeling not just disagreement with, but contempt and disgust toward opponents. The digital transformation of communication and social life has created new contexts for emotional experience and expression, raising both opportunities and concerns. Social media platforms provide new venues for emotional expression and social connection, allowing maintenance of relationships across distances and formation of communities around shared interests. However, research has documented associations between social media use and negative emotional outcomes, including increased anxiety, depression, and loneliness, though the direction of causality remains debated. The design of platforms, optimized for engagement rather than well-being, may promote patterns of use that are emotionally unhealthy. The phenomenon of emotional contagion, demonstrated in a controversial Facebook study that found users' emotional expressions influenced those of their contacts, raises ethical questions about the manipulation of emotional states through algorithmic systems. The increasing integration of artificial intelligence into daily life raises questions about emotional dimensions of human technology interaction. Voice assistants, chatbots, and social robots are designed to simulate emotional responsiveness, raising questions about whether people form emotional attachments to artificial agents and what the consequences of such attachments might be. Emotion recognition technology, which uses machine learning to infer emotional states from facial expressions, voice, or physiological signals, has been developed for applications ranging from market research to security to mental health assessment, though this technology raises significant concerns about accuracy, privacy, and potential for misuse. The development of artificial general intelligence, if achieved, would raise profound questions about whether machines could have genuine emotional experiences or only simulate them. Looking toward the future, research on emotion is likely to be shaped by several ongoing developments. Advances in neurotechnology, including more precise and less invasive brain imaging, may provide deeper understanding of the neural bases of emotional experience. The growing integration of data from smartphones and wearable devices offers possibilities for studying emotional life in natural context over extended periods, though with significant privacy implications. The application of machine learning to large data sets is enabling new approaches to questions about emotion, though the interpretation of findings from such approaches requires care. The replication crisis in psychology has affected emotion research, with some classic findings failing to replicate and prompting greater attention to methodological rigor and reproducibility. The science of emotion has implications for numerous practical domains. In education, understanding emotional processes is relevant to student motivation, learning, and well-being. In healthcare, emotional factors influence both the development and treatment of illness, and emotional competence is important for healthcare providers working with suffering and death. In organizational settings, emotional intelligence, the ability to perceive, use, understand, and manage emotions, has been proposed as an important predictor of workplace success, though the construct has been operationalized in various ways, and its predictive value has been debated. In law and criminal justice, emotional factors influence judgments of responsibility, the experience of victims, and the rehabilitation of offenders. The study of emotion raises fundamental philosophical questions that empirical research can inform but not fully resolve. The question of what emotions are, whether they are feelings, judgments, bodily states, action tendencies, social performances, or some combination of these, continues to generate debate. The question of how to evaluate emotions, whether some emotions are inherently better or worse than others, or whether this depends entirely on context, has normative implications for education, therapy, and self-improvement. The question of whether and how emotions can be voluntarily controlled bears on moral responsibility for emotional responses. The question of whether emotions are fundamentally universal or culturally constructed has implications for cross-cultural understanding and for the applicability of findings from one population to others. Throughout human history, people have sought to understand and to influence their emotional lives, developing philosophical frameworks, spiritual practices, artistic expressions, and social institutions that shape how emotions are experienced, expressed, and evaluated. The contemporary science of emotion, with its methods of experimental manipulation, physiological measurement, and brain imaging, represents the latest chapter in this long endeavor. This science has generated genuine discoveries about the biological basis of emotional processes, the development of emotional capacities, the ways emotions influence judgment and behavior, and the conditions that promote or impair emotional well-being. At the same time, this science remains limited, contested, and shaped by the cultural assumptions of the researchers and populations who have been studied. The emotions themselves, in their immediacy and urgency, continue to pose questions that science alone may not be able to answer. Questions about meaning, value, and the kind of life worth living. The integration of scientific knowledge with humanistic reflection, with attention to the diversity of human emotional experience across cultures and historical periods, offers the best prospect for deepening our understanding of this fundamental aspect of human existence. The phenomenon of emotional memory deserves particular attention, because it illuminates connections between affective experience and other cognitive processes. Events that are emotionally significant tend to be remembered better than neutral events, a phenomenon known as emotional enhancement of memory. Research by James McGaw and colleagues has elucidated the mechanisms underlying this effect, which involves modulation of memory consolidation by stress hormones in the amygdala. When an emotionally arousing event occurs, the release of stress hormones, including adrenaline and cortisol, activates the amygdala, which in turn modulates activity in the hippocampus and other memory-related structures, leading to stronger encoding of the emotional event. This mechanism presumably evolved because emotionally significant events tend to be events that are important for survival and reproduction, making it adaptive to remember them well. However, the relationship between emotion and memory is not simply one of enhancement. Extreme emotional arousal, as in traumatic experiences, can produce memory impairments as well as enhancements. Traumatic memories may be both intrusive, returning unbidden in the form of flashbacks and nightmares, and incomplete or fragmented with gaps in the narrative. The accuracy of emotional memories, including eyewitness memories of crimes and other significant events, has been a topic of considerable practical importance. Research has shown that while emotional events tend to be well remembered in their central aspects, peripheral details may not be well encoded, and memories can be distorted by subsequent information and suggestion. The phenomenon of flashbulb memories, vivid memories for the circumstances in which one learned of emotionally significant public events, was initially thought to represent a special memory mechanism that preserved accurate records. But subsequent research has shown that flashbulb memories, while experienced as vivid and confident, are subject to the same distortions as other memories. The study of emotion in non-human animals raises fascinating questions about the evolution of emotional capacities and about continuities and discontinuities between human and animal emotional life. Darwin's observations of emotional expression in animals suggested that at least the expression of basic emotions is shared across species, reflecting common evolutionary origins. Subsequent research has documented emotional capacities in animals ranging from chimpanzees and other primates to dogs, elephants, rats, and birds. Jaak Panksepp's research identified what he called the affective neuroscience systems in mammalian brains, including systems for seeking, appetitive motivation, rage, anger, fear, panic, social loss, lust, care, nurturing, and play, which he argued represent evolutionarily ancient emotional circuits conserved across species. The question of whether animals are conscious of their emotions, whether they have subjective emotional experiences rather than merely behavioural and physiological responses, is philosophically challenging and empirically difficult to resolve. The difficulty lies in the subjective nature of conscious experience, which is accessible only from the first-person perspective. Behavioural and physiological evidence can demonstrate that animals respond to situations in ways that parallel human emotional responses, but this evidence is compatible with both the presence and absence of conscious experience. Some researchers argue that the similarities between animal and human brains and behaviours make it parsimonious to assume continuity in conscious experience as well, while others maintain greater scepticism. The practical implications of this debate are significant for questions of animal welfare, as the moral importance of animal suffering depends in part on whether animals have subjective experiences of suffering. The regulation of emotion at the neural level involves complex interactions among multiple brain systems. Prefrontal cortical regions, particularly the lateral and medial prefrontal cortex, are involved in the deliberate regulation of emotional responses through strategies like cognitive reappraisal. These regions appear to exert top-down influence on subcortical structures, including the amygdala, reducing amygdalar activity in response to emotional stimuli when reappraisal strategies are employed. Individual differences in the connectivity between prefrontal and subcortical regions may contribute to differences in emotion regulation capacity. The development of prefrontal cortical regions is protracted, continuing into the third decade of life, which may help explain why adolescents show greater emotional reactivity and more difficulty with emotion regulation than adults. The role of sleep in emotional processing has emerged as an important research topic. Sleep deprivation is associated with increased negative affect, decreased positive affect, and impaired emotion regulation. Research by Matthew Walker and colleagues has found that sleep, particularly rapid eye movement, REM sleep, may play a role in processing emotional memories in ways that reduce their emotional impact. According to this view, during REM sleep, the brain reprocesses emotional experiences in a neurochemically distinctive state, with reduced norepinephrine that allows the informational content of the experience to be retained while the emotional charge is reduced. This process may contribute to psychological resilience by preventing emotional memories from becoming overwhelming. Disruption of this process as in post-traumatic stress disorder, where REM sleep is often disturbed, may contribute to the persistence of distressing emotional memories. The experience of mixed emotions, the simultaneous experience of positive and negative feelings, has generated theoretical debate and empirical investigation. Early theories of emotion assumed that positive and negative affect were opposite poles of a single dimension, which would make mixed emotions impossible. However, research has documented that people can and do experience apparently contradictory emotions simultaneously, as in bittersweet experiences of nostalgia, or in the mixture of happiness and sadness at graduations and other transitions. The resolution of this debate has involved recognizing that positive and negative affect may represent partially independent dimensions rather than opposite ends of a single dimension, and that mixed emotional experiences may be more common in some cultures than others and may be associated with particular personality characteristics, including emotional complexity and tolerance of ambiguity. The phenomenon of emotional intelligence has generated enormous popular interest, along with scientific controversy. The concept was introduced by Peter Salovey and John Mayer in 1990 and popularized by Daniel Goleman's 1995 book, which claimed that emotional intelligence might be as important as or more important than cognitive intelligence for success in life. Salovey and Mayer defined emotional intelligence as involving 4 branches of ability: perceiving emotions accurately, using emotions to facilitate thought, understanding emotional dynamics, and managing emotions effectively. They developed ability-based measures that assess these capacities through tasks like identifying emotions in faces and predicting emotional responses to situations. However, the emotional intelligence concept has also been operationalized through self-report measures that correlate substantially with personality traits, raising questions about whether emotional intelligence as measured by self-report adds predictive value beyond established personality constructs. The scientific evaluation of emotional intelligence continues, with evidence that ability-based measures do predict some outcomes, including job performance in emotion-relevant occupations, though the magnitude of these effects is moderate. The application of emotion research to educational contexts has focused on understanding how emotions influence learning and on developing interventions to promote positive emotional climates and student emotional competence. Research has documented that positive emotions like interest and enjoyment facilitate learning, while negative emotions like anxiety can impair it, though the relationships are complex and depend on intensity and specific type of emotion. Test anxiety, specifically, has been extensively studied as a factor that can impair performance despite adequate preparation. Social emotional learning programs, which teach students skills like emotion recognition, regulation, and interpersonal effectiveness, have been implemented in schools worldwide and have been found in meta-analyses to produce small to moderate positive effects on social emotional skills, attitudes, and academic performance. The relationship between emotions and creativity represents another area where affective and cognitive processes intersect. Popular beliefs suggest that negative emotions, particularly melancholy, are associated with artistic creativity, an idea with roots in ancient Greek notions of the melancholic temperament. Research has produced a more nuanced picture. Mild positive affect appears to promote certain types of creative thinking, particularly divergent thinking that involves generating multiple novel ideas. The broadening effect of positive emotions described by Fredrickson's theory may explain this relationship by expanding the range of cognitive associations available. However, negative emotions may promote other aspects of creative work, including the careful, critical evaluation necessary to refine ideas. The relationship between clinical depression or other mood disorders and creativity remains debated, with some studies finding elevated rates of mood disorders among creative professionals, while others question the methodology of such studies. The emerging field of affective computing seeks to develop computational systems that can recognize, interpret, and respond to human emotions. Emotion recognition technology uses machine learning algorithms trained on labeled datasets to infer emotional states from facial expressions, voice characteristics, text, or physiological signals. This technology has been developed for applications including market research, where it might assess consumer responses to products, and mental health monitoring, where it might detect signs of depression or distress. However, the technology raises significant concerns. Its accuracy is limited, particularly across demographic groups and cultural contexts, and facial expressions and other signals may not reliably indicate internal emotional states. The use of emotion recognition technology by employers, law enforcement, and governments raises concerns about surveillance and about decisions being made based on inferred emotional states that may be inaccurate or that reveal information people wish to keep private. The experience of collective emotions shared across groups ranging from small social gatherings to entire nations, represents an understudied but important phenomenon. Durkheim's concept of collective effervescence described the heightened emotional experience that arises in group rituals and celebrations, which he saw as a foundation of social solidarity and religious experience. Research on emotional contagion has documented that emotions can spread through social networks, with people's emotional states influenced by the emotions of those they interact with. Large-scale collective emotions, like the grief experienced nationally following the death of a beloved public figure, or the fear that spreads during a pandemic, raise questions about how individual emotional processes scale up to collective phenomena, and about the role of media and communication technologies in spreading emotion. The philosophy of emotion continues to engage with questions that empirical research alone cannot fully resolve. The nature of emotional experience, particularly whether emotions involve a distinctive kind of feeling, or whether they are constituted by cognitive states like beliefs and desires, remains debated. The cognitive theory of emotions, associated with philosophers like Martha Nussbaum and Robert Solomon, holds that emotions are or essentially involve evaluative judgments about the world. On this view, to feel anger is to judge that one has been wronged, and to feel fear is to judge that one faces danger. This theory faces challenges from cases where emotions and judgments seem to come apart, as when someone continues to fear flying despite believing that air travel is safe. Perceptual theories of emotion, developed by philosophers like Jesse Prince, hold that emotions are perceptions of bodily changes, updating the James Lang theory with contemporary understanding of the brain. Enactivist and embodied approaches emphasize the role of bodily activity and environmental interaction in constituting emotional experience. The ethics of emotion raises normative questions about how we should evaluate and respond to our own and others' emotions. Some philosophers have argued that emotions can be appropriate or inappropriate, that it's fitting to feel fear in the face of genuine danger, and unfitting to feel it in the face of what one knows to be harmless. The normativity of emotions has implications for practices of emotional education and therapy. If emotions can be appropriate or inappropriate, then there may be reason to cultivate certain emotional responses and to extinguish others. However, the standards for appropriateness remain contested. Is an emotion appropriate when it accurately represents reality, when it promotes well-being, or when it conforms to social norms? These different standards may sometimes conflict. The role of emotions in moral life extends beyond their contribution to moral judgment, to include their role in moral motivation and moral development. While moral judgments may identify what is right or wrong, emotions may be necessary to motivate action in accordance with those judgments. The experience of guilt over past wrongdoing may motivate efforts at repair and may inhibit future transgressions. The experience of compassion may motivate helping behavior in ways that abstract moral principles alone might not. The development of appropriate emotional responses, what Aristotle called the education of desire, may be an essential part of moral development, making the formation of emotional habits a central task of moral education. The therapeutic transformation of emotional patterns represents one of the most important practical applications of understanding of emotion. Psychotherapies of various orientations share the goal of alleviating emotional suffering and promoting more adaptive emotional functioning, though they differ in their theories of how emotional difficulties arise and what techniques are effective for addressing them. Psychodynamic therapies focus on bringing unconscious emotional patterns into awareness, understanding their developmental origins, and working through them in the therapeutic relationship. Cognitive behavioral therapies focus on identifying and modifying the thoughts and behaviors that maintain problematic emotional patterns. Humanistic and experiential therapies focus on facilitating fuller awareness and expression of emotional experience. Empirical research comparing different therapeutic approaches has generally found that multiple approaches are effective, with debates continuing about whether effectiveness is due to specific techniques or to common factors shared across therapies. The pharmaceutical modification of emotional states, primarily through medications that influence neurotransmitter systems, represents another major approach to addressing emotional difficulties. Antidepressant medications, including selective serotonin reuptake inhibitors, serotonin norepinephrine reuptake inhibitors, and other classes, are widely prescribed for depression and anxiety disorders. The mechanism by which these medications produce their clinical effects remains incompletely understood, as their immediate effects on neurotransmitter levels do not explain the typical delay of weeks before clinical improvement. Anti-anxiety medications, including benzodiazepines, provide more rapid relief of anxiety but carry risks of dependence and cognitive impairment. The development of rapid-acting antidepressants based on ketamine and related compounds represents a recent advance, though questions remain about optimal use and about long-term effects. The use of psychedelic substances, including psilocybin and MDMA, in controlled therapeutic contexts is being investigated for treatment of depression, post-traumatic stress disorder, and other conditions, with early results showing promise. The prevention of emotional disorders through early intervention and modification of risk factors represents an important but challenging goal. Risk factors for depression and anxiety include genetic vulnerability, childhood adversity, chronic stress, and social isolation. Interventions targeting modifiable risk factors, such as programs to reduce childhood maltreatment or to promote social connection, may have preventive effects, though demonstrating such effects requires large, long-term studies. Universal prevention programs, delivered to whole populations regardless of individual risk status, may have small effects per individual but significant population-level impact. Selective prevention programs, targeting those at elevated risk, may be more efficient but require accurate identification of those at risk. The experience of emotions across the lifespan includes developmental changes in emotional experience, expression, and regulation. Older adults, contrary to stereotypes of aging as a period of emotional decline, often report higher levels of well-being and lower levels of negative affect than younger adults, a pattern documented across numerous studies and referred to as the positivity effect. Laura Carstenson's socio-emotional selectivity theory proposes that as people age and perceive their future time as limited, they shift their goals toward emotional satisfaction and prioritize close relationships and positive emotional experiences. This motivational shift may explain why older adults show attentional and memory preferences for positive over negative information, and why they report better emotion regulation than younger adults. The ending of emotions, how emotional episodes terminate and how people recover from emotional experiences, has received less research attention than the onset and peak of emotional experiences, but is important for understanding emotional well-being. Recovery from negative emotional experiences involves both automatic processes, as physiological arousal naturally dissipates, and active regulatory efforts. Rumination, the tendency to repetitively focus on negative feelings and their causes and consequences, prolongs negative emotional states and predicts depression. Distraction can provide temporary relief, but may not address the underlying sources of distress. Acceptance-based approaches, which involve acknowledging and allowing emotional experiences without attempting to change them, may paradoxically facilitate recovery by preventing the escalation that can result from struggle against unwanted feelings. The contemporary scientific understanding of emotion, while vastly more detailed and empirically grounded than ancient theories, continues to grapple with many of the same fundamental questions that occupied early thinkers. What are emotions, and how do they relate to other mental processes? How should we live with our emotions, cultivating beneficial patterns while addressing harmful ones? How do emotions connect us to others and to our social worlds? How do cultural contexts shape emotional experience and expression? The questions persist because emotions are at the core of human experience, shaping every domain of life from intimate relationships to political movements, from artistic creation to economic decisions. The ongoing investigation of these questions, drawing on methods ranging from brain imaging to ethnographic observation, from historical analysis to computational modelling, promises continued deepening of our understanding while remaining open to the fundamental mysteries that attend all inquiry into conscious experience.